Hey, my name's Stevie, and I am a math tutor over at the University Math Center at Central Washington University. This video is going to be on taking notes. It involves formatting notes, how to color coordinate, reviewing your notes, and what to actually put into them. So, let's get into it. This is how to take notes. So we're going to start by looking at formatting, and more specifically, titles and subtitles. So, you want to have a way to identify where a new section begins. So you can make your main titles a certain way and your subtitles a certain way. As you can see, I've used a box around my main titles and an underline around my subtitles. And then in each section, you want to have a way to identify a new point. So here I use boxes to identify a main point and arrows to kind of go off those ideas. This next point is probably pretty obvious, but it's important to have the title of your notes at the top. So this is how to take notes, so that's what I titled this note as. But this helps when you're looking back through your notes later, especially if you take a lot like I do. As you can see, there's just hundreds of pages of notes in here, so when I go and look back, I'll be able to figure out which one it is by what it's titled as. Alright, the next thing to go along with formatting is to have a way to identify where an example is in your notes. I normally use an EX with a circle around it, which obviously means example, but you can use a heart or a star or whatever you prefer. I just like to use example. Let's check out spaces and margins for our formatting. So it's important to leave space in your notes because notes that are just like a paragraph worth of information can get really confusing really fast. Because when you look back, you have no way to separate what's going on with your eyes. So it's important to leave some space. That's what the paper's for, so don't be afraid to leave space. So the next thing that I want to say is to use the margins of your notes. I know it looks pretty if you just leave that nice gap right there, but it could actually come in handy. So if you write down questions that you have or notes to yourself for your professor, it's a great use of that space. So here I've written down, what questions do you have about taking notes? Alright, the next section we're going to look at is the use of color. There's a couple of different ways to include color into your notes. The first one we're going to look at is highlighting. Highlighting is a great way to break up your notes visually. For example, you can use highlighters to highlight vocab words in green. You can highlight your subtitles in yellow. You can highlight your main titles or section titles in pink. And then any formulas you use, especially if you do a lot of math, you can highlight those in orange. And as you can see, it just breaks up the page a ton and makes it way easier to find what you're looking for. Alright, now we're going to look at the use of color in your actual writing of the notes. So just like you can use highlighter to break up your page, you can also use pens and pencils that are different colors to show different things in your notes. So for example, you can use a green pencil to show when you're making a note to yourself, as opposed to just taking regular old notes. You can also use red to show mistakes in your notes. So if you ever make a mistake and you want to correct it, just go ahead and use some red, and then that way you don't have to erase anything, you can just show that you made that mistake and you fixed it. And finally, if you want to really make those margins pop, you can also use a different color for that. So here I've changed the margin to purple, and when I make notes in the future in the margin, I'll make them in purple just so it's really obvious and it reminds me that I have a question I need to ask. So as far as content goes, obviously it's going to depend on what class you're taking notes for, but this is kind of just a generalization of what you should be putting in your actual notes. Let's start with what to take notes on. A good rule of thumb to follow is if the professor writes it down, you write it down too. But this is only if it's new information or information that you've forgotten, and you want to write it in your own words. And we'll come back to this more in the next section. Another tip is to write down anything you're for sure you won't remember on your own. So this could be like formulas, main ideas, vocabulary, etc. If you don't think you're gonna remember it on your own, make sure you write that down because you definitely won't remember it if you don't write it down. I know I've already mentioned this point, but I want to mention it again. to write questions that you want answered in the margin. And you might ask, why is this important? And I'll answer that in a second, but it is super important. You also want to remember to answer those questions and make a note of it under your question once you've asked the professor or whoever you're going to ask. That way you won't forget. And that's also why it's important to write it in the margin so that you won't forget what your question is and you'll actually ask it and follow up on the answer. I also want to take a second to talk about what not to take notes of. One thing to leave out of your note taking is things that you already know really well. So anything that you're a master in, don't take notes on because it's just going to clutter up your notes for no reason. And just save that room for things that you don't know already. This might be another obvious one, but don't take notes on anything that is wrong. I have a tendency to do this when I take notes where I'll write down something that I'm just speculating on and I don't really make a note of if it's true or not. It's important to not do that because once you read back over your notes, you might mistake it for being true and study the wrong information. It is important, however, to put speculations into your notes if your professor asks you to write down what do you think the answer is or something like that. So for an example, if you're trying to figure out what the square root of 2 is and you speculate that it's 1, go ahead and put a question mark next to it just to identify that it's actually maybe not true, and then make a note to ask if that's the right answer or not. That way you don't go back in your notes and see something that's wrong and study it as it's right. You can also go through and make corrections and say, well, actually that's not true, and fix it. And here's a couple other random tips I wanted to include in this video. So if your teacher or professor is a really fast talker and you need to take notes in a hurry, something you can do is try to shorten up your notes by using abbreviations or some other ways of shortening your thoughts. For example, if your professor has in their notes the sentence, "Do not write out the entire sentence because it takes too long," this can be written out much more simply as shorten your thought. And it means the same thing and it's so much shorter. It takes up like half the amount of. And I talked about this earlier, but I wanted to just elaborate on it a little bit. It's important to write notes in your own words because it'll ensure that when you read it back later, you understand what you're saying. Finally, we're going to look at a couple quick tips for reviewing your notes. Remember that the whole point of taking notes is to be able to review them later, so make sure that you actually follow up and do this, and do it often. So you want to review your notes first when you get home from your class. This way you've given yourself enough time for it to sink in and then you can go back and review it. Also review your notes before the next class. So for instance, if you have algebra one day and you take notes that day, the next day when you come to class, read those notes right before so that you're refreshed on what you learned the day before. And finally, review those notes right before any tests, quizzes, or homework assignments, or before you study, just so you're all brushed up on the material that you've learned before you go into an assignment. Now that we've gone over some of the basics of taking notes, this will get you off and running in your classes, and you're going to do great. Thanks for watching.